Hi there, class. In this video, we're going to continue our crash course on logic by starting to talk about how you can evaluate, what standards you can use to evaluate arguments. In this video, we're going to talk about the difference between evaluating the content versus the logic of an argument. We're going to talk about deductive standards, validity and soundness. We'll talk about an imagination test you can use to determine whether an argument is valid or not. And then we'll do some practice examples. And then we'll close by talking about inductive standards in terms of strength and cogency. So you'll remember in the past video, we talked about how to define an argument. It's a series of statements, some of which supposedly provide support for one of the others. And so remember, there are two kinds of statements that make up an argument. First, there are the premises from which we infer the conclusion. The premises are meant to provide the support. The conclusion is what the argument's trying to convince us of. So when you see an argument like this, one natural thing to do is to try to evaluate the argument by looking at the premises and the conclusion, looking at what they say, and asking, well, are those things true or are they false? When you do this, you're evaluating the argument's content. You're evaluating what claims the argument makes. But notice there's this other aspect of an argument. There's this inference from the premises to the conclusion. Those premises are being put forward in an attempt to provide support for the conclusion. And so we can ask, well, do those premises actually support that conclusion or not? When we ask that question, we're now evaluating the logic or reasoning of the argument. Now notice these things can come apart. Some arguments might have good content but bad logic. Other arguments might have good logic but bad content. Here's an example of an argument with bad content, but has good logic or form. So the argument says Dr. Samuel Taylor lives in San Francisco. San Francisco is in California, therefore Dr. Samuel Taylor lives in California. When I say that this argument has bad content, this is because what the premises say isn't true. I do not live in San Francisco. But notice, the argument does have good logic. The reasoning is perfectly fine. Those premises do support that conclusion. So now let's compare that to an argument that has bad logic, but its content is fine. Dr. Samuel Taylor lives in Alabama. Auburn is in Alabama. Therefore, Dr. Samuel Taylor lives in Auburn. So when I look at these premises and the conclusion, and I evaluate whether they're true or false, well, everything looks good. I really do live in Alabama. Auburn really is a city in Alabama, and I really do live in that city. But there's another sense in which this argument is quite bad, and that's because even though the conclusion is true, it does not follow from those premises. Those premises do not support that conclusion. And that's what I mean by saying that an argument can have bad form or logic even if it has good content. This video is mostly going to focus on how to evaluate the logic or reasoning of an argument. And so to do this, we can distinguish between two kinds of standards of evaluation. There are deductive standards and inductive standards. So the deductive standards are the evaluative standards we'll use when the premises aim in some way to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. But inductive standards are the evaluative standards we'll use when the premises aim in some way to make the conclusion probable. So notice that the difference between these two kinds of standards involves how we try to evaluate that supposed connection between the premises and the conclusion. When we use deductive standards, we're trying to determine whether or not the premises provide conclusive support to that conclusion. But when we move to inductive standards, we are thereby trying to decide whether the premises provide probable support. So let's start by talking about these deductive standards. When we evaluate the logic of an argument using these standards, we're going to talk about whether the argument is valid or invalid. So a valid argument will be one where, if its premises were true, then the conclusion necessarily must be true as well. Or another way of saying the exact same thing is an valid argument is one where it's impossible for all the premises to be true while the conclusion is false. Validity is not the same thing as truth. So when we evaluate arguments as valid or invalid, we are not assessing whether the premises are true, and we're not assessing whether the conclusion is true. We are assessing the relationship that does or does not exist between the premises and conclusion. This is the number one mistake that students make when thinking about validity. They think in terms of truth instead of thinking in terms of the relationship. So how can you go about trying to test or determine whether an argument is valid or not? One thing you can do is use what we might call the imagination test. The first step here is just to imagine that all the argument's premises are true. And you should do this even if you know that those premises are false. So even if one of the premises says that Sam is a robot, when you're testing for validity, you want to say, okay, let's imagine that the premise is true. Let's imagine that Sam really is a robot, like the premise says. Then the second step is you need to ask yourself, well, can I simultaneously imagine that the conclusion is false? If you're able to imagine that, that means that the argument is invalid. That means even if all the premises were true, like you're imagining, they wouldn't provide a guarantee that the conclusion is true as well. And so the argument is invalid. If the answer is no, then the argument is valid. And that's because the idea is, if all the premises were true, like you are imagining, you realize that the conclusion has to be true as well. And that's just what it means for the argument to be valid, is that if the premises were true, they would thereby guarantee the conclusion. So let's do a couple practice examples. Consider the following argument. If Jane's passport is expired, then she isn't allowed to travel out of the country. Well, Jane's passport is expired. Therefore, we conclude that Jane isn't allowed to travel out of the country. Is this argument valid or invalid? This argument is in fact valid. Notice, I don't know who Jane is. I don't know where she lives. I don't know what the rules are about where she lives. I don't know if she has a passport. I don't know if her passport is expired or not. So I don't know if any of these things are true. But I don't need to in order to decide whether the argument is valid or invalid. Instead, I just say, okay, look, let's imagine. Let's assume that the premises are true. It's impossible for me to imagine that the conclusion is false while I'm simultaneously imagining that the premises are all true. And so I know that the conclusion follows from those premises. If those premises were true, they would guarantee that conclusion. Let's consider another example. Premise 1 says that if your philosophy professor's name is Samuel, then his name starts with an S. Premise 2 says your philosophy professor's name starts with an S. Therefore, your philosophy professor's name is Samuel. Is this argument valid or invalid? So this argument is invalid. If you thought the argument was valid, one mistake you might have been making is the one I mentioned earlier of confusing validity with truth. If your name is Samuel, then your name starts with S. And look, I'm your philosophy professor, my name really does start with an S, and my name really is Samuel. So you might have looked at that and go, well, yeah, everything it says is true, and so you maybe thought it was valid. But remember, validity isn't about whether the premises and conclusion are actually true. It's about the relationship between them. And to get at that relationship, we need to use the imagination test. So let's imagine that premise 1 is true. Let's imagine you spell Samuel with an S. It's pretty easy to do. Now let's also imagine that your philosophy professor's name starts with an S. Could you also imagine that your philosophy professor's name is not Samuel at the same time? And you are able to do that because you can imagine that your philosophy professor's name is Stephen. When you imagine that, premise 1 is true, premise 2 is true since you spell Stephen with an S, but even though you're imagining that those premises are true, you're simultaneously imagining that the conclusion is false. And so our imagination test shows that those premises, even though they are true, they don't guarantee the conclusion. And so the argument is invalid. Let's consider one last argument here. Premise 1 says all alligators have tails made of gold. Your philosophy professor is an alligator. Therefore, your philosophy professor has a tail made of gold. Is this argument valid or invalid? In this case, the argument is actually valid. Now, if you thought the argument was invalid, It's yet again probably because you were confusing validity with truth. You might have looked at this argument and said, this argument doesn't make any sense, it's ridiculous, alligators don't have gold tails. And your philosophy professor clearly is not an alligator. Everything it says is false, everything it says is ridiculous. That doesn't mean that the reasoning, that the logic is bad. That doesn't mean that the premises and conclusion aren't related to each other in the right kind of way. And so to get at that relationship, to determine whether that relationship is there, we need to use the imagination test instead. When we use that, we say, let's imagine that every alligator has a tail made of gold. And let's also imagine that your philosophy professor is one of those alligators. Well, if you imagine that I'm an alligator and every alligator has a tail made of gold, well then that would guarantee that your philosophy professor, me, would have to have a tail made of gold. That conclusion couldn't be false in that world we're imagining. And so, if those premises were true, then they would necessarily guarantee that conclusion is true as well. And that's just what it means for the argument to be valid. Now, one reason validity is important is because valid arguments are guaranteed to preserve truth. What I mean by that is that if you put all true premises into a valid argument, then you are guaranteed to arrive at a true conclusion. Of course, as I've said, the mere fact that an argument is valid does not guarantee that its conclusion is true. And that's because if any of the premises you put into the valid argument happen to be false, well then it's still possible that you might be led to a false conclusion. And so look, even though validity is important, what this shows is that it's not the only thing that's important. Another thing we care about is whether the premises of the argument are in fact true. And so this leads us to talking about deductive soundness. A sound argument is one that meets both of the following conditions. The argument is deductively valid, but it also has all true premises. So if you're going to try to test whether an argument is sound or unsound, this is the process you should go through. First, you ask yourself, is the argument valid? Well, if it's not valid, then the argument is unsound because it doesn't have good logic. If the argument is valid, then we need to ask, are its premises true? Is every premise that we put into that argument actually true? If no, if even one of the premises is false, then the argument is unsound. But if all of the premises are true, and the argument's valid, then the argument is sound. So let's do a little bit of practice here. Consider some of these arguments we've already seen. All alligators have tails made of gold. Your philosophy professor is an alligator. Therefore, your philosophy professor has a tail made of gold. Is this argument sound or unsound? This argument is unsound. Notice, when I go through that process, well, is it valid? We already decided it is valid. Well, are all of its premises true? No, because premise 1 is false, premise 2 is false. And so the argument is unsound when we use that flowchart that I just showed you. Let's consider another argument we've seen. If your philosophy professor's name is Samuel, then his name starts with S. Your philosophy professor's name starts with an S. Therefore, your philosophy professor's name is Samuel. Is this argument sound or unsound? Yet again, this argument is unsound. In this case, it's not because any of the premises are mistaken. In this case, it fails at the very first step of that flowchart. When we ask, is the argument valid? We say, no, it's not. It's invalid. And from that, we can conclude that the argument is unsound. So that's all we're going to talk about for deductive standards. But now I want to say a little bit about another kind of standard you might use when evaluating some kinds of arguments. In order to see why we need these other standards, I want you to consider the following argument. Imagine I say, look, my daughter thinks that movie theater popcorn is absolutely delicious. And whenever I've brought her to the movie theater in the past, she has always, every single time, she's asked me to buy her popcorn. And then I also know that I'm going to bring my daughter to the movie theater this weekend. Well, I might conclude that my daughter's going to ask me to buy her popcorn this weekend. I might go through this kind of reasoning in my head to try to make plans and budget. I better make sure that I have enough money to pay not only for the tickets but also for the popcorn when I go. But is this argument deductively valid? No. Because even if we imagine that all those things are true, it's still possible for us to imagine that at the same time, maybe we go this weekend and something weird happens and she does something out of the ordinary. And so the argument is deductively invalid. But nonetheless, when you look at this argument, you probably think, this seems like a really good argument. It seems like the reasoning is actually pretty reasonable. And that's because here, it looks like the premises are trying to do something different. When we look at the premises and the conclusion, we notice, well, they don't conclusively support the conclusion. Nonetheless, it looks like if all of these things were true, they do make it likely that my daughter is going to ask for popcorn this weekend. So this is why we need inductive standards. So here, instead of talking about validity, we're going to talk about whether the argument is a strong argument or a weak argument. A strong argument is one where if the premises of the argument were true, then the conclusion would probably be true as well. Or another way of saying the same thing is that a strong argument is one where it's unlikely that the conclusion is false while all the premises are true. And now we're going to get to the idea of a cogent argument instead of a sound argument. An inductively cogent argument is one that meets both of the following conditions. The argument is inductively strong, so it has the good logic by inductive standards, and all the argument's premises are true. So now that we have these deductive and inductive standards, I can say a little bit about the process you should go through when you evaluate arguments. First, you need to identify all of the argument's implicit and explicit premises and its main conclusion. And then you need to perform a logical analysis or a logical evaluation of its reasoning. So here you ask, what standards are appropriate? Should I be using deductive or inductive standards? After that, I can ask, well, what's the form of this argument? Now, that might not make much sense yet, but the next video will talk about an argument's form in a lot more detail. If we're using deductive standards, we can ask, well, is its logic valid or invalid? If we've decided that inductive standards would be more appropriate, we can ask, well, is its logic strong or weak? We can then perform a factual analysis of its content. Here we say, well, what reasons are there to believe that the premises are true? What reasons could there be to potentially doubt what the premises claim? And could we think of any counterexamples to the premises? You can also ask, well, what are the implications of this argument? And are those implications plausible or implausible? You might also look for any remaining issues with the argument, maybe some informal fallacies, maybe some worries about whether it's going to be able to successfully persuade someone. Now, we haven't talked about informal fallacies in this video, but our reading did talk about it, and we will talk about it in class at various times throughout the semester as well. So what have you learned in this video? Well, you've learned the difference between deductive and inductive standards. You've learned about the difference between an argument's logic and its content. You've learned what it means for an argument to be deductively valid or invalid. You've learned how to use that imagination test to check whether an argument's valid or invalid. You've learned what it means for an argument to be sound or unsound. You've learned that process for checking whether an argument is sound or unsound. You've also learned what it means for an argument to be inductively strong or weak. You've also learned what it means for an argument to be inductively cogent or uncogent. And you've also learned a very rough outline of a process you can go through when you're engaging with and evaluating arguments.